measure about 20,000 parameters. Let me tell you, if you go to a doctor and you say, I want to test everything I can, well, not one of our doctors, but I mean another normal doctor, they will test maybe 40 factors. And if you say, no, I want every test that is possible, and you go to all the different specialists, so now maybe you can test around 100 factors. It's not enough. It's like trying to put together a jigsaw puzzle when it's a million-piece puzzle, and you have 40 pieces. How on earth can you find out what that picture is from that few pieces? You cannot. So every piece of information that is measured today in the so-called modern medicine, they're relevant pieces for sure. It's just you don't have enough pieces to see the overall picture. And that is why we focused on finding ways to find additional pieces. So now we have the ability to measure about 20,000 factors. Still not enough. Out of a million-piece jigsaw, it's still not enough. And we keep developing, and every year we have more pieces. But 20,000 is at that level where now we can see what's called a homeostasis. When you have enough pieces of a jigsaw to see what the picture forms, you also know a lot about the missing pieces. And then you know what to look for and which direction to move to find those. Like if you have a landscape picture and up there in the blue sky you're missing some pieces, then you're looking for the blue pieces, right? And it's easier to find them when you know what to look for. So that's the level where we are at now, that we can see the overall picture with a lot of individual pieces. And once we find out what's not functioning right, then we go really deep into finding why is this not functioning right. So there's underlying causations always, a combination of factors that make it possible for a problem to develop. Nothing develops without a combination of underlying causations for that. Genetics is in that category, but it's a small factor in that category. There's no genetic disposition that automatically creates a disease. So there are other factors that are usually more primary, such as the cell voltage potential, such as the difference of pH inside and outside the cells, because you need that for the electrolysis process of exchanging ions, such as the oxygenation of the cells, the mitochondrial function, the childhood programming at a more psychosomatic level. You know, there's so many underlying causations that play a bigger role than the genetics, and there's a combination of them. So once we find out what's not functioning right, we focus on finding out why could this develop. And because also when it develops, we have a huge buffer capacity for everything. You can donate one kidney to someone who's in need of a kidney, and you can still have perfect kidney function. Every function in the body is like that. You have a huge buffer. So you can actually mess up a lot and still have normal functions. So when something is dysfunctional, it means that first you use that whole buffer, and now it developed to a dysfunction. And that cannot happen from a single factor alone, with a few exceptions. But those exceptions are so few that the rule of thumb is it's always a combination of factors that makes a problem develop. And in addition to the underlying causations, you have trigger factors that trigger this development to happen. And they couldn't have triggered it if there wasn't a combination of underlying causations. But the underlying causations would also not have caused the problem if it wasn't triggered by something. And then the third, at the causative level, in addition to underlying causations and trigger factors, is the capacity you have to deal with any challenges. And it is the other factors that might have compromised your ability to deal with this. When it comes to viruses, I can give you an example of a category there. So this is something also to think about now with the viruses. There's two things that are known to make the situation worse when it comes to a viral threat. One thing is when you have an IgG reaction to something that you're eating. So if you're not breaking down the food properly, then it is the right thing to do for your immune system to attack it. Because partially broken down proteins are called peptides, and these peptides can be very, very damaging. So then we cannot leave something damaging in the body without attacking it. So a food intolerance is a good mechanism where the immune system attacks something that actually needs to be attacked, because you're worse off if it's not being attacked. One way of having food intolerance reactions is with IgG. So IgG will then wrap in these things, these peptides, and then it will create something called an immunocomplex, and then you can get rid of them. And then you might get tired after eating and things like that, or maybe you won't have that much symptoms from it at all. But IgG is there to deal with viruses primarily. It's one of many mechanisms that the immune system has to deal with viruses. It's supposed to wrap in those viruses, not those peptides from the proteins you can't break down properly. So the most damaging peptides are from wheat gluten and A1 casein, which is in dairy. There can also be many other peptides, and there are blood tests you can take to find out what causes IgG reactions and this and that. But it would be, in these times, with this threat of the COVID-19, it would be a good idea to avoid wheat gluten and A1 casein, which is in dairy, which is also why the food today didn't have any of those things. So that's one thing. The second thing is that it's also well documented that the cells can be weakened from 5G radiation even more than from other types of radiation. Well, except of course ionizing radiation like from a nuclear plant and atomic bomb and things like that. But the 5G is even worse than the other forms of mobile signals. It's actually far worse when it comes to the integrity of the cellular health. So I mentioned earlier that you need the cells to be strong so that they won't allow this new program that comes in to reproduce more of the virus and to whack them out completely. So it would be a good idea also to stay away from those test areas where they are testing now the 5G. There are 2 institutes in Russia, millimeter wave institutes, who's done about 20 years of research on millimeter wave signals such as what they use now in the 5G. And they've well documented how that impacts the cellular health. So in those test places where they've now rolled out the 5G, what's very interesting is that it coincides with the same places where you have the biggest problem now with the COVID-19. So there's this conspiracy theory now that this is why someone created the virus and let it out in public on purpose to mask the problems caused by the 5G. Well, of course, that's ridiculous. You know, nobody would do something like that, and it wouldn't work either, you know, in the long run. So the virus obviously was leaked out of this lab in Wuhan, and also there is a high risk of leakage from these kind of labs. So we should not have those kind of labs in the first place. We should shut all these kind of labs down because the risk is too high with having them, right? But it does coincide with the places where you have this high, where they're testing the 5G, like in northern Italy, like in these places now in South Korea, like in Wuhan. Wuhan was one of the first places to test the 5G. They have you know, the highest density of 5G antennas is in Wuhan. So it's interesting to see how something that we already know theoretically that cellular health is weakened by, that also we see it in reality that the clusters now of the biggest outbreaks are in the places where they are testing the 5G. So that's another idea, is to try to avoid living in a place where they are testing the 5G, because you will be more likely to catch it and you will also be more compromised when it comes to how to deal with that. You need strong cellular health, not additional factors to weaken it. So, a little bit back to our whole methodology, and then I will stop. I understand I'm over the time here. But you told me I could have a few more minutes, so thank you for that.
Now I'm standing here.
And now you're standing there, so I noticed. So when it comes to health, what is important is to have capacity to deal with threats. It is to have awareness of what's going on in the body, what's going on around you. It's to make the right choices in life, to find out what's going on in the body. Health optimizing clinics specialize in that. If something is not functioning right, we can stimulate your own self-healing, self-regulating mechanisms to deal with that in a better way. And that is basically our preferred recipe for health. And in these times, this recipe is more important than ever before. Thank you.